Um, so today we are going to be doing the Victorian and the late Victorian, excuse me, and the fin de siècle, or the turn of the century, and the Edwardian. Now, the reason I linked them up together is because we're starting to not worry about terms as much as we're sort of thinking about silhouettes. The period itself ultimately is incredibly active in that people are really striving for modernity. They're striving for some sort of sense of what is the most modern thing. And a lot of that comes from the sense that people can access so much more than they'd ever had. They can access more information, whether through magazines or books. They can access products in a way that they never had before. So for example, I brought in two different things. One, I brought in, this is a reproduction of both of these things, but this is a Jordan Marsh catalog. Does anybody know what Jordan Marsh is? It's a department store that used to be in Boston. It was very popular. If you've ever been to the Macy's in downtown Crossing, that used to be the Jordan Marsh. And now it was turned into Filene's. They took it over. Then I think Kaufman's for a short period of time, and then eventually Macy's. But you could mail order the most up-to-date sort of garments. And they have catalogs from Macy's and from Gimbel's and from Bloomingdale's. And you could, if you lived, I don't know, Missouri, wear exactly the same thing that somebody in a very fashionable city like Boston might be wearing. And what is great about these is certainly you can order almost anything, clothing, textile related, all the way to corsets. We also have here, this is a reproduction as well. Let me just make sure that's shown up. A reproduction as well of a Sears Roebuck catalog. Sears, which was at the time one of the most important purveyors in the country. They basically sent everything they could to the West to basically build up the West. And they were sort of Midwest centered, Chicago. So things got out quicker, to the West that way. But what made Sears important, not only did they have clothing, which was probably similar to the clothing that you would see there. There we see hammocks, boots. We could see hats, but also things like, like furniture. This is from 1901 or 1900. Fireplaces, wash kettles, knives, everything you would possibly need for your home. Brent.
If you could order something, was it the actual like outfits from the time, or were they like recreations?
Well, this is a 1900 catalog. So
so
this would be like 2021. Right. You're ordering the thing that exists.
This is like the old Amazon.
Right, exactly. Well, actually, that's an excellent representation because just like Amazon, Sears offered everything available to people, especially if you're out in the West. You might have some access to things, but as you want to invest your wealth, you can buy furniture sets, you can buy fashionable textiles, anything that you possibly want from Sears, including seed and animals, and they would be shipped to you in a few days. And you have to imagine, this is like the World Wide Web in so many ways, this is like Amazon in that way. So the idea of conspicuous consumption becomes incredibly interesting during this period, because if you have the money, you can purchase almost anything that is available to anyone else in the world. When we're talking about clothing, one of the things that's interesting too is the development of the paper pattern, or what we call today commercial patterns. So what does that mean when I say a commercial pattern? Yeah, go ahead, Mel.
Is that a pattern you can buy in store?
Okay, it is a pattern for a dress or a piece of clothing that you can use those pieces, cut them out, and sew them together to make something. Now you have to imagine, this started in about 1871, I think, by Butterick. You have to imagine that that also brings modernity to everywhere. If you can get the pattern, you order it, it's sent to you in a week or so, you can be at the pinnacle of fashion right then, along with your ladies magazine, a Sears catalog, and a pattern. You can pretty much make anything and do anything. And you have to remember, now that people have sewing machines, now that people have access to these things, they can dress as fashionable as they want to. One of the things for you to also know about the paper pattern is the University of Rhode Island actually has the largest collection of paper patterns, commercial patterns in the world. It was started by my predecessor, Joy Emery, and it was her lifelong dream to sort of develop and understand the paper pattern, and she created the COPA, the COPA, which it's not available anymore right yet, but it's available in the library. All of them are in our library here on campus. And what makes that really special is we have documentation of the very first pattern that was ever created all the way through to contemporary patterns. And people send us patterns all the time. These big pattern companies like Butterick here, at the end of their season, will send the whole box to them. And in fact, they don't hold on to them. They would contact Joy if they needed to reprint something, because that was really popular for a while, that they would have what was called Vintage Vogue was one of them. Butterick has one. And they would write the university and say, do you have this pattern? And they would, send them the pattern. In fact, one of the very first Vintage Vogue says the University of Rhode Island pattern collection on it. Exactly. And I made it for an exhibit that Joy was doing. So it's really fun, but you could order almost anything. This is just from 1892. And you can see the variety of things that you could order patterns for that you could then whip up in your own home based on, sizing. And that's the last thing that's really important about this when it comes to clothing, is the idea that now we also need to come up with, between pre-made clothing and these patterns, a sizing model to understand how we can standardize clothing. Now, we don't understand sizing today. It's different everywhere. But in truth, there is a standardization to sizing that we follow in the fashion industry and the costume industry and such, but it has almost no relationship to any clothing you'd see in the world, because it doesn't go lower than size 6. Size 6 is basically the smallest that you can make. Now, we know if you go into a store, you can get 00s, 000s, things. That doesn't exist. That would be negative measurements in a lot of ways based on the proportions that we talk about. But it is necessary, because if we're creating things, we can't create something for mass marketing individually for every permutation possible. Yeah.
So you said in like the fashion industry, size 6 is the smallest?
Size,
like the standard?
So what is happening now,
Yeah.
and this probably started about 1950 or so, maybe into the 60s. They started making what we call vanity sizing, taking it and making it smaller with a number that was smaller, but it probably relates to, say, size 6.
Oh,
right?
So what was set as?
Right. Like a waist on a size 6, which I think is the smallest one in most, in like the thing, is like 20 inches, and there's nobody that I know of, period, who's ever had a 20-inch waist, right? Then you would be going down even further than that. And as you know, when you get younger, your waist actually thickens, right? So we use vanity sizing to make you feel better about it so that you will then buy it, right?
Oh, I
Yeah.
was wondering where that came in, especially since like when we think of fashion, we think of like the runways and like the really small like models and like
Right.
the sizes. So I just thought it was
But they would
interesting.
probably be a size 8. You know, my mom freaks out. Now, my mom is the weeest little thing. She's about this tall and she weighs about 90 pounds, if that. And she always used to be a size 10 and she was fine with that. But now she can't even buy clothes because if she put on a size 10, first of all, it generally wouldn't fit her. But she's like a size 0, 00. She's like, I don't even understand how this works anymore. But a lot of it is about this idea of advertisement. And even when you look at the Jordan Marsh catalog, you see now that we have conspicuous consumption, we also have to advertise for conspicuous consumption. And what this leads to is actually an art movement in a lot of ways. One of the big art movements of this time frame we call the Art Nouveau. And we're going to see some of it today, but most of the most popular or the most famous Art Nouveau images are for advertising because they're using, beauty and elegance to sort of infer what their product is, because now they're having to compete against everybody. And so it's very, very interesting to see how with this modernity, we start to reevaluate how we clothe ourselves, how we live, the music that we listen to. We were listening to a little bit of ragtime when you came in today. And so ultimately, it's all tied up into this very strange world. Okay? Now, when we're talking about clothes, again, we're really focusing on women's wear. Now, the reason that we focus on women's wear is that is really what does change in this period. Little details in men's clothes change, and we'll talk about those as we get there. But really, it's almost impossible to keep up with the style change, specifically the sleeves, because every 15 minutes, it seems like there's a new sleeve that is fashionable. Now, again, I'm not going to ask you to remember all these details. And even myself, if something comes up on Instagram and I play the guessing game, I'm like, what year is that? When it hits the 1890s, especially about 1893, I'm at a loss because there's multiple things sometimes happening even within that 1 year. But I tried to break it down just to give you a little sense of where we're going. So remember where we left off, all the way on the left. This still kind of feels a little bit like bustle era, right? A little bit more columnar, a little bit more straight. The only way we know if this was bustle is which way? Yeah, we have to turn it, right? But truly, if we turn this, it would have a very similar appearance all the way around. In 1891, often there would be still a little bit of padding in the back as that bustle sort of melts away. But ultimately, it's pretty columnar. We see our bodices fit relatively well, often still things like basque fronts and such. And then we see the skirt has fullness in it, but it's not to the degree that we're going to see as we move along. Now, what also makes this kind of interesting for me is, and I mentioned this when we were talking about the 1880s into the 1890s, is our first step of puff sleeve is that it moves up. So it sticks up in the air a little bit. And then slowly, as the period moves along, they inflate, and they inflate, and then they deflate. And then they reinflate, and then they deflate again. And we don't tend to see that sort of sleeve return at the end of this. Now, when we're thinking about this stuff, when we use that general term Victorian, a lot of times this is the stuff we're thinking of, right? That 1880s, maybe into the 1890s. But really, we're only talking about a 10-year period where any of these things were popular. So, one of the reasons we take this class, hopefully, is to reframe the idea of visually how things look. So by the time we get to 1892 or 1893, we start to see, as I said, those sleeves start to volume up a little bit. Our bodices stay very round. We sort of go from a fit bodice into something that feels very undulating. And then our skirts start to flare a bit. Now, when I talked about that idea of gores, these ideas of cut panels. This is why gores are incredibly important, because as that skirt moves, we're going to recut and recut and reshape using each of these panels to make a better skirt. And so what we see through the period is, it sort of feels like a rectangle in a sense, and then it gets a little bit more triangular by putting more fullness at the bottom. And then slowly we start to reshape the top so it feels a little bit more hip-like, and then flare. Sometimes we call that a trumpet skirt, or just a really gored skirt. And then by the time we hit the turn of this, into the turn of the century, the Edwardian, we see fit almost all the way down, kind of to the knee, and then if we have any flare there, leading us to the end by the war times, where we think incredibly narrow. We can see how structure and support is going to play into this in a lot of ways, especially the corset shape. Because as we look through this, we see bodices like we understand, right? Where they sort of end at the waist. But what happens as we start to get into the teens is we start to see even more fit down through the hip. So what is our structure going to need to do? What is our support going to need to do? It's going to need to go further down and further down and further down, to the point when we have corsetry that literally goes down over the rump, over the hip, and over the crotch in a sense. They almost look like little mini dresses. They're just entirely engulfing the body. And you can imagine that that would make you somewhat rigid in your movement, so that by the time we get to 1909 and into 1914, we're really trying to slim down that silhouette from top to bottom. If you notice, again, the skirt starts to disappear to the point when we get down to 1914 and we're in this very narrow, but we also see our waistline move up generally as we go from, true waist, and then we have a little bit of a dip in the basque, and then we kind of go back to true waist, and then notice it starts moving up. Like we have that almost directoire idea where it's fit, but then it's rounding here. And when we look at these two, we can see a great deal of reference not only to Greek and Roman, but we will see a reference kind of reflecting back 100 years to 1814, the empire, the regency. But think about it. This is only 5 years away from 1920. This is only 22 years away from 1920. So it's very interesting to think about how we move so quickly, because especially as Americans, we start playing this game of what is the most modern? What is the most modern? So we have talked about Charles Worth, and Charles Worth is still a fashionable designer in a sense, right up until about this time, about 1895. But he's kind of like old-fashioned in some ways. And we start to see new designers coming to the forefront, like Calais Soir. We see Lucille, who is another designer who was actually on the Titanic as well, who are starting to imbibe a bit more modernity to these things. And especially when we start to think about the American market, we want sort of people who represent the Americans as well. Now, what's interesting about Charles Worth had a store in Newport, in the casino. If you've ever been to the casino, there was a Charles Worth outlet in a sense there. Not like the Gap outlet at Rentham Mall, but what would happen is they would make your clothes, say, in Paris, and then they would send it to Newport, and then you would be fit in Newport, and it would be finished in Newport, or if you couldn't get to Paris, you could have your measurements done there, or you could bring your clothes, your Worth clothes, to the Worth store, and they would refashion them or reshape them or refit them to you. They even had some items that you could purchase there, but still, it's like haute couture. It's like Chanel, right, on Bellevue Avenue. But some of these other designers start to come forward, as well as, brands that are part of these department stores as well. But he starts to be looked at as a little old-fashioned. And by, well, in 1898, I believe he dies, and his son takes over, and he tries to refresh the business, but it doesn't really go so well. And by the teens, I think it is closed entirely. The only thing they kept, though, perfume. And in fact, you can still get Worth perfume today. But that was when it starts this big transition. And if you are interested in department stores, there's a whole lot of really cool stuff out there about it. There was a guy named Harry Selfridge who has a store, built a store in London called Selfridge's. And he kind of created the whole identity of the modern department store. Like when you walk into a department store, what's the first thing you walk into almost always? Right, cosmetics. Why would you put the perfume right by the door?
The first thing you see, so you're going to want it.
Well, it's C, but think even more.
No.
Right. Imagine the streets of New York, horse poop and dirt. You open those doors and you feel like you're in a whole new world, right? And certainly cosmetics up until that time were considered to be a bit taboo and a little racy and risque. He put them right down front, saying it's okay, enjoy it. It's not like you're buying something devious, you know. You can enjoy cosmetics and use them for what they are. So silhouettes we're going to see change quite a bit. Now what I've done here is I've sort of brought in a bunch of things. Most of them are real. Only one of them is a costume. But what I really want you to look at is the silhouette shaping. And if you look at this one, which was, this came in a plastic bag one year, just with a bunch of Worth gowns and a whole bunch of other 19th century stuff. I think maybe it was worn once or twice because you can see a little bit of creasing, but it's in immaculate shape. But you can see the sort of shape that is created, and you can see that it is entirely boned as well. So we tend to think about that corsetry doing the work, but the clothes on top of it would also have support in it as well. I put some paper towels in there because you can see a very short-waisted person into a very rounded hip, right? If I remove these, you can see the whole thing sort of collapses, and that's not how we would want it. We would want it really shaped. Now, down here, I've brought in just a few other little bodices so you can kind of see, but notice how structural they are inside. You can see that there's boning as well. We see here, I'll bring this a little closer. We see here this waist tape, which would be really important because that centers the whole thing on the waist so it doesn't shift, it doesn't spin, it doesn't move. But it also allows, is this the one that has it? It also allows you to put, now it's right behind, but you can put, you can kind of see it back there, your brand name on it. You can put your designer, you know, it doesn't have tags in the back per se, but on that waist belt, you can put your brand. So, you know, a lot of these pieces, we know where they came from and who made them because it's on that belt there. And you can see in some of these other elements here, you know, some of the shaping that is created in this, as well as the internal work to make it look like just a casual little throw-on thing for a bodice. Okay, here I brought in a costume. Now again, I don't generally like to bring in costumes, but many of them aren't, you know, we just have bodices or we just have a skirt. So this sort of gives you a sense of it, but even more so I can roughhouse it. And we can tell this is getting a little bit later, just like this one. You notice how these sleeves kind of go up and then out a little bit, but notice how these really round out. So now we're sort of in the 1892, 1894 realm, and you can see how it is cut to the body. And notice that the skirt is made up of lots of little panels, little gores, to give it a triangular shape. Gives it lots of fullness, in a sense, at the bottom, lots of swish, as I like to say, but it molds somewhat over the hip to give a roundness, so we don't have a lot of extra fabric in this place. And then, as many of these skirts are in the period, they have that bit of drag on the back, so when you walk, it looks more glamorous. My mask is fighting me today. Right in my eyes. The next one, we see a black silk bodice with lace on it, and we can see that this also, we're starting to feel it move down. So this is telling us that it's sort of towards like 95, 96 perhaps. But you can see how, you know, the details of lace and draping and things are very popular. We can also see this idea of black, and a lot of the things that we have in our collections are black because they would be used for mourning and kept separately. You wouldn't wear them necessarily every single day. So we do have a lot of black in there. And, you know, Queen Victoria also wore black once her husband died. So there was some fabulousness there. But you can see how that would sort of go on the body. And if you notice, all of these have open necks because those could be worn with dickies, with collars on them. And that's the other thing that sort of moves in this period is this idea of the collar, how that fits onto the neck. Finally, over here, change slides, sorry. Oh, well, it's right next to the blue dress there. But you can see we're starting to get towards the end of the 19th century, because notice how the sleeves, though there's a little bit of fullness, they're really starting to feel pretty straight. And you notice how this has a pretty clear, solid waist on it. Now, again, all these things could all be worn in 1898, but this would probably be a little bit more fashionable. And we can start to see this idea of the rounding of the bosom. Can you see how this is starting to round out? They started to call this beetle bosoms or wasping because it sort of felt like a wasp waist. Like if you think about a bug where you have the abdomen and the thorax, you know, this sort of feels like that. And notice that the bust isn't, it's rounded, it's monobosom is what we call it. And eventually we get to the point by the 1900s that we're really trying to create this S curve where our bodies feel like they're rounded in the front and rounded in the back. And then finally, by the time we get to 1900 and into the teens, we felt our waist move up, 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 up. And now we're left with gowns that have a much more empire line. We're going to see variations of that as we look through the slides. But ultimately, the idea of these gowns, no, I don't have it here. Sorry, folks. Those of you there, you don't get it today. Sorry. But this one is probably from about 1909 or so. And you can see, again, there's a lot of callback to things from the past, right? A little bit of Rococo, a little bit of Empire, a little bit maybe even of Cavalier in that all. So you can see it's moving incredibly quick. And then almost as soon as this is done, we're in the 20s, the true 20th century feeling, the most modern of all the times. So does this big kind of silhouette idea sort of make sense? It's a lot to take in, but that's really what we're focusing on now. Yeah.
How would you best describe the sleeves in 1914?
In 1914,
comparison to
tubular and fit. Tubular. And we're going to see a variety of different things happening, but ultimately a lot of them are modeled on other cultures and other styles that sort of add to it. We're going to do it. Oh, because I had it upside down. There we go. Okay, so for those of you at home, I can't see chat, so if you have a question, please. I need to minimize that. I need to do this, and we're going to play. Go away, go away, go away, go away. Thank you. Okay. So this is kind of what's challenging, because when we look at this whole time frame from 1880, right, where we're looking at that natural form, working our way through the bustle, then all of a sudden, once we kind of hit the 1880s, it's kind of anything goes. The big thing is volume and a wasting that then goes away as quickly as it starts, that comes back as quickly as it starts. And ultimately, we have, you know, a lyrical silhouette that is trying to develop through the course of this period. And as we move forward, can you see how we're starting to create that rounded bosom, very similar to the round gown, into that S curve that works its way through into a much more fitted silhouette? And can you see the waistline getting higher, higher, higher? Well, if we know anything, what's going to happen in the 1920s?
Oh, it's gonna drop.
It's going to drop down. And again, it's not the true waist, like all of a sudden their waist wasn't here, but it's that fashion waist that the 20th century is really known for. Okay? It's a pretty period. And then all of a sudden now we're talking super slim. And if we notice through here, can you see sort of, again, Grecian ideas, Cretan ideas, Regency ideas sort of playing in there, as well as this modern silhouette, which balloons out and then all of a sudden starts dropping. It's crazy. There's so much to take from it. And again, people are wearing this then, and people are wearing this then as well, because it's what you think looks good on yourself. And certainly some of it is old-fashioned and some of it is the wealthy carrying over, but we get sort of a sense of the movement of the silhouette through the period. Okay, so here we're looking at Art Nouveau. And notice it's a very lyrical style. It's using what I call simplicity. It's taking things and simplifying them a great deal, and yet still keeping an organic nature. Like if you think about these roses, they're simplified and they're kind of cut and pasted in that they have a very similar idea, but they're still feeling pretty organic. Or if you look at the leaves up here, and then you can see here the lyrical silhouettes there, those S curves, those undulations. But what is this for? Champagne. And part of it too is if it's too detailed, you can't reprint it, right? It becomes more difficult. And so Art Nouveau, and certainly like the arts and crafts movement that happens right around this time as well. You know, I love Frank Lloyd Wright. So I'm obsessed with everything that's arts and crafts in my life. But it's all sort of coming from a similar place, but a lot of it ends up finding its way into advertisement. And it's, you know, it's tempting, it's drawing you in. Notice here the leaves, see how they kind of look like they're rubber stamped, just different sizes, but they still feel organic. They're not like Art Deco that we're going to get to, where everything defined into geometry, right? But again, notice the undulations, notice the curves. There's an organic naturalness to it that is very different than what we've seen before. And one of the few sort of Art Nouveau artists that we really recognize is Klimt. And here we can see a beautiful painting. There's a whole movie about this painting. I think it's called was it Golden Woman? Woman in Gold. But you can see there's a great deal of a drawing on ancient themes in this, you know, this sort of Byzantium, a little bit of sort of the Persian styles or even Babylonian that is infused with a very modern style as well. His most famous painting, obviously, is The Kiss. So here we can see, remember this corset? Remember the blue one? We saw this before, and we can see how this could be worn all the way through. But notice here, we're looking at one from 1907. Yes, 1907. You can see how far that's starting to move down, really down on the hip, because we would want our body to curve all the way. And in fact, you can see this little dip in the front. What are these two things?
Garter belts.
Okay, it's the garters to hold up your stockings, exactly. And what's going to be interesting is we're going to see how they layered these. It's very strange, very awkward. But you can see how the body is going to undulate and change through the form of corsetry. Here we can see a summer or a lightweight corset in which, if you notice, the upper half is kind of mesh, and then you can see the rows and rows. But do you notice how it's reshaping the body into that sort of abdomen of a bug shape, right? With that monobosom through here, and then that sort of roundness all the way down to the hip. I mean, the photograph doesn't even finish capturing it. It's so long. You can still see the bust, but the bust part of it is still soft. Now, why would we want to have that soft? Well, because our bodies don't naturally do this, do they? No, we would need to reinvest in some ways in our bust. But you can see how long this one is. I mean, it's almost like a mini skirt, right? So what would they do? Is they would use something to plump up their bust. And so here we can see a variety of different bust enhancements that could be worn underneath the stay, underneath the corset if it had room, or could be worn on top of the corset that when your gown went over, it looked like you were much more rounded through the bosom and would minimize the sort of double bust. So here you can see one that's all ruffles, that once the dress went on, it would sort of round out. Here we can see one that you could stuff if you needed to with just padding. And then here you can see one that your corset would go on, and then you would put this on top of it. And you can see it's, you know, like the natural body isn't really in there. But this isn't a corset itself. It's actually a garment to keep the gown in that form, in that shape. So you can imagine that you probably have a little bit of placement in here. You can hide all sorts of things, right? And in truth, Bernadette Banner did one of these, and hers kind of comes down the back and actually attaches to the corset. So it would just sort of be a shield or a front. So again, going back to this, how much movement would we have? Look at that bust that runs down the front. I mean, that looks like steel. And so I love to show this because yes, it is lyrical in its silhouette, but it doesn't look comfortable, does it? She's like, I am very comfortable right now. And we can see that shaping all the way through the hip, you know, nice and smooth down through the waist and down through the hip. We even do see some forms of corsetry for things like this, for pregnancy. Now, again, last time I had mentioned this idea of ancient. If you were pregnant in the period, you know, once you started showing, you were swept away. Either you went to Europe on a tour or you went to visit your sick aunt and then somehow magically you came back with a baby. Pregnancy was kind of considered to be sickness. But if you also remember, you know, you don't have support there because your body hasn't taken that on. So sometimes people wore corsetry all the way through their births, through their pregnancy, excuse me. Or they might even have, like in this case, through gauze and shaping and some elastics, some ability to support the baby. Or in this one, which I love, the one here on the right, you can see that it has little lacing areas. So as you get bigger, you could sort of release the lacing. And I mentioned this idea of tea gowns, which we're going to see some examples of, and that would be incredibly useful garment during pregnancy. So here we can see a shift underneath. We can see the corset, but notice that the shift comes out underneath the garters, right? So those shifts are going to start getting shorter because you don't want necessarily all that bulk, but sometimes you see them where it feels like just swoopity-doo because they're all caught underneath all of those garters. And we can see the stocking and we can see the shoe as well. What are we looking at here? It is. It was the very first bra. This is the patent for it, which was made out of two handkerchiefs and a strap. And so we're looking at it tilted from the side. This is the center front. That's over one shoulder. That's over one shoulder. And then it would strap around. Now, again, this isn't like a bikini that you would just wear this, but it's something to support the bust underneath your corset, underneath your stay. eventually, as we know, it becomes something that we wear all the time. And as it develops, we can see items like this, which look very much like a bralette that you may buy in a store today, you know, that doesn't have underwire and such, but something that can easily go under clothes. Yeah.
So question. So say, so with bras,
Yeah.
people wear the bust enhancements over the bras?
So you would put on, say, because it wasn't called a bra then, it was called a camisole,
Okay.
but you put that on first, then you put on your stay, then you would put on your bust enhancement. Yeah. But I always look at this and I'm like, I wish they still made this because I think lots of people would wear this.
Oh, I would.
It's so pretty. It's really pretty. It's out of silk and with the, you know, the insets. Okay, so we're ready to look at silhouettes. Where are we? Earlier. Okay.
I forget the first.
We're still in the what period, in a sense.
Oh, the last one that we were just in.
Right, which we call
The bustle.
the bustle, right?
Yeah,
So
bustle,
we see
yes.
we see very clearly that bustle. And really the first thing that happens is this starts to, we don't have that understructure necessary. We really just have pads. And I showed, you know, we're going to see it starting to move into more body conscious, but we start to see those things peaking up. By the time we're in the 1890s, we can see, you know, pretty much a straight sleeve, a fit bodice, a little bit of rumpiness back there, but not a ton, and a sort of straight skirt. What's going to happen as it goes along is it's going to increase in volume. So here we can see, this is from 1897, but sort of sets the tone for it. We can see gored skirts. So each of these sides is made up of multiple panels shaped like triangles. And you can see that this is like a 5-gore skirt. This one's packing in more, right? And this one packs in even more to create smoothness over the hip, over the front, and sometimes even in the back. So it's not like everybody has an all-purpose one type of skirt. It's like you can really create what you want. And so when we look at them at the front, we can tell this is like 92 because it's not really huge volume. But can you see how we can guess there's probably a little bit of swish and movement, but it's still pretty column-like. And then as it goes along, the skirt starts to get volume, but we're staying pretty clear, pretty clean to the hip. And our sleeves are starting to get some volume in them. Now, you're going to see a lot of brown because when I built this slideshow originally, I was obsessed with brown Victorian dresses. I just love them. I don't know why. It's me. But we get a sense of that movement. And you can see how much more thought needs to go into all of those shapes, you know, to create these bodices, to create these skirts, and how patterns would certainly be incredibly important. Here we can see the level of detail that becomes important too, because everybody starts having access to the correct silhouette and maybe even pattern pieces for it. We're going to need to, as wealthy people, invest in the details. So here we're looking at the back of this jacket. I mean, first of all, look at the color of this red. Like literally, you want to eat it. It looks so, I don't know, there's just something about this kind of reddish black that it just feels so decadent. And you can see the front of it over here, but notice how much embroidery and how much detail is going into that. And some of this, and we're going to see it in a few of this, is because of colonization. Because the English were taking over, you know, different countries and sort of, you know, going to India and going to Japan and going to China, they're setting up industries for embroidery and for piecework that are then being used in garments. So, you know, a lot of this does come at a cost, but look at how beautiful that whole thing is and how much detail and how much embroidery is in it. Yeah, Brian.
How much would something like that cost?
It's impossible to say, you know, I mean, one of the things, like even if you look at these magazines, you know, the suits in here might be $20, right? But that's still like $450 today. if not more. So, I mean, I don't know, $10,000, $15,000?
Back then or now?
Nah, probably now. Probably now, but it is hard to say because it depends on if that was already arranged, you know. But, you know, you could tell this is somebody who has wealth, though, right? Compared to that person, I mean, a nice piece of cloth, don't get me wrong, well cut, but certainly there's a lot that separates these gowns. Here we can see a few other things that are happening and become kind of trending in some ways, I guess you could say. But here, you know, compared to that kind of silk, satin, taffeta world, we also have this much more draped, romantic, not just romantic costume history or romantic, but, you know, these soft textiles being, you know, draped and moved around in the bodice. We can tell this is mid because of the volume of the sleeve, right? And notice also the height of the collar. And in truth, this actually may be, I want to say maybe like 1905, partially because of the collar, but that's how weird it is. Like, you know, one day it's the straight sleeve, the next it's a puffed, but notice the intricate details that are in that, and the softness with the chiffons and the silk gauzes and such. Here we can see what I would call a day outfit or a receiving outfit. And you can see it almost has a suit-like quality to it, right? With a jacket and a blouse, though, much like these, it would be done all in one, right? But notice how this one feels like a gown kind of from the Rococo. Like if you removed this part here, right, and put a stomacher in there, it would almost feel like a Rococo gown, right? Down to the engagement. But what tells you it's not Rococo besides that? Notice the puff sleeve, which we didn't really see, and also the skirt shape, right? So you can see they're drawing on all these elements of history. And notice this beautiful lace detailing that runs all the way down the front and around the whole thing. I even love that it sort of buttons, but then these two are kind of open. Like, oh, it's just casual. Here we see probably a dinner dress, partially because of the sleeve length and the way that this is dealt with. But notice the kind of graphic nature of this one. I mean, these are two very different people, or two different characters in a sense. So you could start to see how taste and your own style starts to fall into place. And you can see in this sort of champagne pink, each of these gores and how much those shape over the body, and even the detail up through here. But then on this jacket part of it, just rows and rows of intricate detail, as well as coming down, emphasizing the silhouette. Yeah.
Are those gloves too?
Yeah. And that's probably what made me think it was probably a dinner outfit as opposed to a ball outfit, because a ball outfit wouldn't have sleeves. Here we can see three young ladies somewhere in the world. Are they wealthy? Are they middle class? We don't know. They look good. They got great silhouettes. They have nice details on it. But that's one of the things that becomes kind of frustrating is everybody, if you have the means to make or the means to procure, you know, everybody kind of has the ability to have nice clothes in some ways. And here we can see great silhouettes, great movement. Notice again, the breadth that is created through those sleeves into a fit waist, and then beautiful shaped skirts. And these great hats too, right? Here we can see a wedding dress. This is from 1892. And we can see those sleeves starting to sort of jam out. But one of the ways that this, you know, sort of informs me that this was probably based on Charles Worth is, do you see this asymmetrical ruffle that's kind of coming around? That was one of his sort of trademarks, was asymmetricality. And even in these gowns, these kind of wrapper style gowns, there's a really interesting asymmetricality there too. I want you to focus on this person here in the center. Look at that shape, right? We get the sense of breasts, but do you notice how it's molded within an inch of its life? And that's the second way that we can understand status in a very different way. Because you would need to have somebody create that directly for you to create such a managed shape, right? Look at that. I mean, there's not a wrinkle in it. If you look at the hip here, I mean, that is smooth in its shape. And we can even see here. So, fit becomes incredibly important in sort of that, in the style and in the shape. You can see the sleeves, the volume of the sleeves, but just great detail in all of these. See, brown. I love the brown. Notice the shaping here, again, very similar to that one, which is sort of, it feels casual like a jacket, but it is actually a bodice. And then notice all the details going on down here. My favorite little detail, though, is they've sort of taken this puff sleeve, which I've stolen a few times in things, and then sort of tack that flower in like that. So it's obviously a fashionable sleeve, but it's sort of revisited and re-understood. Here we can see one probably about 1895, 1896. And again, two very different people, right? With two very different styles. Here we're seeing tiers of lace in this very sort of floral pattern with then the velvet and the draping. Lots of different styles. This beautiful tailored jacket. I mean, again, because of the work, the embroidery that is on this, as well as the fit, that would certainly tell you that this person was of status, right? This isn't a little something you're picking up at H&M. And then we even see sort of like, this isn't just sort of historicism, but it's also kind of cultural. Like it kind of feels like it might be a Swiss bodice, sort of in that same way of the shepherdesses and such, but it feels like a corselet over a blouse with a sleeve. But really, it's all one piece, that you put on. So it looks much more casual than it ever would be. But look at the detail in that, just incredible. And just to mess your life up, these are the stylish sleeves of the season. What isn't stylish? I mean, like, you've got straight sleeves with a little bit of puff. You've got big full sleeves, super full sleeves, half little sleeves. I mean, anything goes in a lot of ways. This one is remarkable. It looks like a piece of candy, doesn't it? When I showed this last time, somebody's like, why are you showing us pictures of mushrooms? Here we can see that full on volume, right? Notice the sleeves going into that really tiny waist. And then notice again how this gored skirt is really fit down. And then it starts to feel the flare. And what I love in this is this feels like an 18th century men's suit, right? Almost like that directoire style, because we see these really wide reveres. We see the double-breasted waistcoat underneath, the jabot, so they're drawing on some of these things from history. Look at this. So dramatic, isn't it? I love everything about it. And we can see that beetle waist starting here. This is from 97. And notice this skirt almost feels like complete triangle. Here we can see a suit as well. And again, notice that asymmetrical detailing there. And even here, there's something about it that feels almost Regency as well. Now, again, this could be fashionable. It could be like that one guy that we showed that it didn't fit. I don't know, but it looks pretty cool. Then we can see how high that neckline is coming down from there. And then that cute little hat. I love a good hat. Here we can see some morning clothes. And again, now we're sort of in 1898, 1899. And notice how fit that skirt is now, how high those necks are, how pinched those waists are. And notice that the basque has kind of gone away for a little bit. And now we're just dealing rectangular bodices in a sense. Here we see a house gown. And notice that roundness there, that S curve, and all the detail. Again, you just can't do this yourself. You can't be like, oh, I'm going to do this, even though we all do it now. Or this person. Like, what is going on? There's a lot happening here. But notice that it's really like that S curve, like really creating that silhouette. And notice how shaped that is into this trumpet style or this flare right down at the bottom. Yeah.
Is that a scarf?
Yeah, so that's a scarf in which it's been gathered at intervals all the way down. But things like boas, things like scarves were very popular in, as we get towards the end. This is very hard to see because it's very moody, but notice that it all sort of rounds out like the round gown, then fits through the bodice and then moves. And if it was just a little bit more contrast, you'd see that this part is velvet to there, the rest is chiffon, and then there are these beautiful embroideries. But then we can tell this is later. Notice there's no fullness at the top, but it does have kind of what feels like a bishop sleeve returning. And here we are kind of at 1900, where the emphasis is going to move down, but it's going to pop out again, and then it's going to go away. But we could tell it's from 1900 because of that little pigeon front, that little blousey blouse. 15 minutes. We can do it. We could do it. Why can't we do it? Here we can see just a very simple day dress. We can tell it's later because of the fit through the hip. Notice that it moves all the way down. Notice the sleeves aren't quite as dynamic. And we can see a little bit of lace and a little bit of blousing there and that straight across waist. Here we can see a great deal of that fullness. And if you remember those bust enhancers, can't you see that fitting in there to give us that mono bosom? And just like that round gown that we looked at, the waist is kind of diagonal, right? It starts out low, but then it goes a little bit higher. So we have a sense of roundness. But these lawn dresses, these white dresses were very, very popular. Can you see all this sort of inserted embroidery and inserted lace, which makes it feel often like underwear, which some people call these lingerie gowns. I don't love to call them lingerie gowns, but look at that. Just stunning, right? And you can see all this beautiful pin pleating detail here. And again, notice the fit really just goes right over the bosom, rounds up, and then rounds back. And again, we can tell we're at the turn because of that drippy sleeve. And if we look at this, can you see the tiers of ruffles? Doesn't it kind of feel like the gown à la reine? Right? Just a simple white gown sashed at the waist, tiers of ruffles around. I call this a graduation dress because every time you see girls graduating at the turn of the century, they're always wearing this style of a dress, but it's probably directly from the gown à la reine. Dynamic, so theatrical, isn't it? So this is a designer from the time that we don't talk about very much named Beer, and his stuff is like graphic and crazy and kind of embraces a lot of that Art Nouveau style. But what you're looking at here is actually black net over a white dress. So see all those stripes? Those are all individual stitched pleats all the way down. And then you can see the pleats running this way as well. So it has a very graphic nature to it. It's really beautiful. Here we can see another dress with just, I mean, a lot of stuff going on there. Here we can see an evening gown. Now, if you notice, the sleeves are going to start to go away in a lot of cases to the point where we're just at straps. Now, you do see some sleeves on things, but this sort of silhouette tends to be a bit more fashionable. And how do we know this is wealthy? Notice the beautiful textile, the weaving on it, or the damask on it is so large. You would have to think that through. And if you notice, like there's a seam right there, it continues, right? So you're wasting a lot of fabric because of the way that you would have to cut these. Here we see another evening gown, and notice how beautiful, that fits over the hip. And what makes this remarkable is this gown is said to have been lined in mink, though it's probably just mink trim, but you can see the full sleeves there, the detailing, the embroidery, really beautiful. And here's another dress. This is from 1895. And this feels, again, kind of like that directoire style, those round gowns or the Regency. They're pulling from practically everything. This feels almost cavalier, right? And we can see the movement of the bodice there. And again, every dress is more beautiful than the next, for my money. It's just, everything is beautiful. We can tell that we're later. Notice the waistline, a little bit higher. We're starting to get into the Edwardian. Notice the sleeves, pretty straight. And again, if we dropped that waist, we can see a direct movement to the 1920s. This would feel like a 1920s dress, but we can see how that's going to play. And notice the embroidery on this sort of Indian embroidery that can only happen if you're incredibly wealthy. And here we see, you know, an evening gown that for all intents and purposes, you might see on the red carpet somewhere, right? With just a simple strap, fitted bodice, full skirt. And that black dress becomes very popular. Now it's a little hard to see, but this is actually flocked. And this is one of Charles Worth's son's dresses. It's very similar to this dress here, which is silk satin. And then this is kind of like velvet that is woven into it. So it creates this beautiful detail. But this was considered super old fashioned, you know, because it just feels Victorian and you want something modern. Notice that deep, deep bass. But again, there is no saying that there's not incredible craftsmanship happening here. And then we're going to see some at-home clothes, what I call reception or day clothes. So this is just a little something you could throw on to, you know, if somebody came calling. Here we see that tea gown that I had mentioned, which is basically just a smock, right? Full from shoulder to hip or to hem, much like the sack gown. But can you see how they've tied it in 3 different ways, you know, to sort of play around with it to get a sense of what works. And you can see if you were pregnant, that bow could just keep going up and going up and going up, and then you'd show and then you couldn't wear it anymore. But just a general at-home gown. Here we see this gown's very similar to that graduation gown, right? But also we could see very gown à la reine happening. And notice that it feels like it's just sort of at the waist. And this one we would call a tea gown too. But notice that this one is completely fit, right? Shaped entirely to the body all the way down. Here we can see some different pregnancy sort of robes and gowns and such. They're very hard to find. And here we see a suit from 1900, beautiful in linen. It looks just like a man's outfit with even the 4-in-hand tie and the disposable collar. Here we see a sailing outfit. Here we see a tennis outfit. Being active was very important. Here we can see a bicycling outfit. I mean, this is like crazy pants. This one I just added because I just saw it the other day. But bicycling, becomes a very popular hobby. This is what many of them sort of look like. They're a little bit more neutral, but come on, fabulous. It's like Maria von Trapp, right? Like I've got all these curtains. I got to make something out of it. Here we can see some swimming costumes, and they're not much different than what we looked at before. We can still see they're made of wool. You could still see the bloomers underneath. If you look at the guy back here, he's just wearing sort of a knit, you know, one-piece, almost wrestling outfit. Even here, we just see underwear, but, you know, women would wear very, you know, sort of heavy wool, dark things. And in Newport, the men would swim naked and the women would wear lots of clothes. Now, I do have to mention the Gibson girl because it is so important visually, especially this idea of this effortlessness, this American girl who is smart and educated and, you know, traveled the world. And we talk about this hairstyle, the Gibson girl hairstyle, which is this perfectly coiffed imperfection. You know, it looks like it was just tossed up, but really it would take so much time for it to happen. And it gets the name from Charles Dana Gibson, who was the illustrator of it. And we can see here that sort of perfection of hair. It feels kind of sloppy. Remember when the messy bun was in for a while or things like that, but you really have to work hard to make it look like the good messy bun? Same thing here. You can see that there are waves and undulations, but it is just like, oh, I'm just tossing my hair up. Beautiful, absolutely beautiful. The counter, oh, I don't know why this keeps moving. Anyway, we can see some shoes from the period as well as stockings, just really beautiful. But the men's styles from the period, not much has happened, is there? Now, this is only because this painting was done with a lot of splatters and such. They didn't have like floral suits like that bicycling suit. But really to look at the silhouette, what really changes? Not much. And so little details become incredibly important for men throughout the period. And here we go. This is the sort of comparison, the male comparison to the Gibson girl, and I call it the Leyendecker man. And Leyendecker was an illustrator from the period who did more covers of the Saturday Evening Post than Norman Rockwell did. If you know anything about Saturday Evening Post, we sort of tie it to him. But look up his work. It's incredible, incredible work. Worked for 30, 40 years. But his man, the Leyendecker man, is smart and confident and young and athletic. And even if we're looking at this suit with a little difference in the lapel and maybe a little different in the jacket length, it feels pretty modern suit-wise, right? Nice, thin, tapered trouser, little bit of a cuff just above, a very fit sleeve on that. Notice my favorite, the club collar, the tie, just very American, very graceful. We can see men's shoes, things like Oxfords, which are just like shoes we might see today. My favorite, the Balmorals, that castle in Scotland. I wear them every single day, right? We can see tennis shoes, which look kind of like tennis shoes today. We can see bicycling shoes, and we can even see like an evening shoe with elastic gussets. So when you put it on, it just fit right to your foot. And so now we're going to go back to Edwardian, and we're just going to see how that moves into much more of a column. I know it's a lot. We're going to do it. We're going to do it. How can we not do it? And we can see that our emphasis is on this very narrow skirt and this very clean waist. And a lot of this comes from modern designers like Poiret, who's really re-envisioning the silhouette. This one's a Calais sweater. And you can see this has kind of a Japanese kimono quality to it. But notice that it's very high-waisted, very fit through there. And here, this one's from 1908. And then here we see 1907. People are wearing all sorts of things. We can see this sort of empire style. Can we see a lot of Greek in this, a lot of empire, 1808 in it? In fact, here we can see Paul Poiret's idea for what the period looked like. And we can even see Greek and Roman detailing in there, but that really strong empire style that sort of resonates, but with a modern twist. And you can see how even in this, which feels like a dress, can you see the emphasis is on the bosom, on that empire line? Here we see an evening gown. And again, that sort of drape, that sort of movement down the body, very similar to that one, is really important. Here we can see coats, and even coats are susceptible to fashion. We see the high-waisted here, and then in the exact opposite, a super low waist. It's crazy. That's why I love it. Here's another Poiret illustration, and look at that. I mean, look at the silhouette he's trying to create, right? And just like all good fashion designs, this is what it really kind of probably looked like, right? You can never really quite get to that, but you can see the volume. We can even see like how the 20s may be sort of falling into place there. His most famous is called Sorbet, and we can see that lampshade skirt that was sort of popular, and also this idea of the hobble skirt, these skirts that were so narrow that you had to hobble in them. You couldn't, you only had a little distance. You can again see the Asian influence in this, in that top. And he often pulled from many different cultural places. I'm just going to show a few more as we go through. But he pulled from the Ballet Russe, which did a 1001 Arabian Nights, Scheherazade sort of event. And so he decided he wanted to have a party that was 1001 Arabian Nights. And he basically costumed all his guests. And you can see here that lampshade skirt that he tried to make really popular. But Sorbet, when you really see it, that dress, it wraps up here, it never looks as graphic and as beautiful as that. And then kind of finally, artist-wise, I want to talk about Fortuny quickly. And this is a Fortuny gown. And Fortuny was an Italian designer and sort of was drawing even more from the Greek and the classic ideas. And what Fortuny is known for is this textile. Can you see that it's all crinkly? This was all, if you've ever done broomstick skirts or anything like that, it's the same idea. It's antique pleating. And what makes this stuff remarkable is it never comes out. Like you could wash it and those pleats still stay in there. In fact, when you buy these dresses, they would come in a circular box because you would twist them and put them back in the box. But if you look, there's sort of pins all the way down the shoulder. It feels very Greek. And it also accommodates to many different styles. You could see somebody wearing this today, right? And it's just incredible. And you could see all those very, very tiny creases that run all the way down. You can even see the buttons that run all the way down, as well as that belt, a lot of different things. Yeah, Fiona. Fortuny, Fortuny. Here you can see basically the same dress, but notice how when it goes on a different form, it changes its silhouette because of those pleats, you know, it can undulate. But they made these in hundreds of different colors. They were incredibly popular, incredibly expensive. He also drew from sort of the Middle Ages as well, in Byzantium. And so here you can see a cloak. And here you can see a dress from a Fortuny dress from the 1980s, right? Definitely pulling from all those things we know about the 80s, the 1980s. And then we also have to compare this to the war, which was happening in Europe at the time. And we see sort of a return in some ways to a lot of those earlier Edwardian values. So we're looking here at a dress from 1919, you know, which doesn't feel modern at all, but some people want to hold on to that. And we will see some references to kind of military informing us. Like if you look at this jacket, the second from the right, notice those low patch pockets, right? That feel very much like a military jacket. And this idea of skirts getting higher and higher. I mean, this is so we see Levin, Pekin, Drier, Pekin, you know, sort of new people influencing it. Can you see the waist moving down? Here we can see a suit from the period towards the end. And we see, you know, super military inspiration there, right? With the patch pockets, the sort of boxy jacket, the Norfolk going on there, versus a real uniform from the period. And you can see, again, similar ideas, but it's through the fit and through the shape. C'est ça, fin. There we are.